Malcador the Sigillite, the most powerful human after the Emperor. Warhammer 40,000. Malcador the Sigillite was one of the most important figures in the entire history of the Imperium of Man, yet compared to the towering legends of the Primarchs, the Emperor, and the great heroes of the Space Marine legions, his name is surprisingly easy to overlook. He was not a Primarch. He was not a genetically engineered super soldier. He did not command one of the great legiones Astartes. He did not stride across battlefields wearing ancient Terminator armor, carrying a relic weapon, or leading thousands of warriors into combat. Instead, Malcador was an old man. A seemingly frail, elderly human dressed in simple robes, carrying a staff crowned by a golden aquila. And yet behind that unremarkable appearance was a mind that had survived thousands of years, a psychic power that placed him among the most powerful human psykers who had ever lived, and an authority so immense that the Emperor of mankind trusted him to speak and act in his name. Malcador was the Sigillite. He was the Emperor's Regent. He was the first Grand Master of Assassins. He was one of the architects of the Imperium's most secret institutions. He helped create the foundations of the Inquisition. He played a critical role in the creation of the Grey Knights. He influenced the organization of the Space Marine legions. And when the Horus Heresy reached its final and most desperate moment, when terror itself was on the verge of falling, Malcador performed perhaps the greatest act of sacrifice in Imperial history. He took the Emperor's place upon the Golden Throne. He knew exactly what that meant. He knew that the power required to hold back the warp would destroy him. He knew that he would die, and he accepted it. That sacrifice allowed the Emperor to leave the Golden Throne and confront Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Without Malcador, the Emperor could never have fought that final battle. Without the Emperor, Horus might have won. And without Malcador, the Imperium as humanity knew it might have ended that day. This is the story of Malcador the Sigillite, the ancient regent who stood beside the Emperor before the Imperium even existed. The secret architect who helped build many of its most powerful institutions, and the man who ultimately gave his life so that the master of mankind could continue his final battle. Malcador's true origins are surrounded by mystery. Even the Imperium possessed few records capable of explaining where he came from or how he survived for so long. By the dawn of the 31st millennium, Malcador was already more than 6,700 standard years old. That alone made him extraordinary. Humanity had experienced entire ages during Malcador's lifetime. Civilizations had risen and collapsed. Worlds had been colonized and forgotten. The age of technology had reached heights that later generations could barely comprehend. Then came the age of strife. The warp storms isolated human worlds from one another. Human civilization fractured. Entire planets descended into barbarism, anarchy, or technological stagnation. Terror itself became a nightmare of warring techno-barbarian kingdoms. And throughout these immense changes, Malcador endured. He remembered the distant past. He remembered things that the Imperium itself had forgotten. He could apparently remember his own date of birth down to the second. That detail reveals something extraordinary about the man. Malcador was not simply old. He was a living connection to humanity's lost history. The title Sigillite was derived from an ancient Terran term associated with seals and their bearers. But the title carried much deeper meaning. Malcador had been associated with the Sigillites, an ancient and extremely secretive organization dedicated to preserving humanity's cultural and historical treasures from before the Age of Strife. While countless artifacts, records, artworks, books, technologies and memories disappeared during humanity's collapse, the Sigillites attempted to preserve what they could. Malcador was apparently one of them. Perhaps the last. The Sigillites understood that knowledge itself could become a weapon against oblivion, and Malcador carried that philosophy with him into the future Imperium. When the Emperor began his rise during the Unification Wars, Malcador eventually became one of his closest allies. The exact circumstances of their first meeting remain mysterious. But what is clear is that the Emperor trusted Malcador in a way that almost no other human could claim. The Emperor created the Primarchs. He created the Space Marine legions. He commanded the armies that conquered terror and eventually launched the Great Crusade. Yet for all his power, The Emperor needed someone who could manage the countless political, administrative, and secret responsibilities that came with ruling an emerging galactic empire. That person was Malcador. The Emperor could conquer worlds. Malcador could organize them. The Emperor could inspire armies. Malcador could construct institutions. The Emperor could destroy his enemies. Malcador could ensure that the machinery of the new Imperium continued functioning after the battle was over. This made him indispensable, and the Emperor gave him an extraordinary level of authority. As Imperial Regent, Malcador could speak and act in the Emperor's name. He could make decisions on Terra while the Emperor was away. He could issue orders. He could manipulate political factions. He could establish secret organizations. He could influence the development of the Imperium without ever needing to stand at the center of public attention. Malcador preferred the shadows. That was where he was most effective. While the Emperor became the symbol of humanity's future, Malcador became one of the hidden architects building the machinery that would support it. Among his greatest accomplishments was helping establish the Adeptus Administratum. The Imperium was not merely a military empire, it was an enormous bureaucratic machine. Millions of worlds, fleets, armies, officials, governors, and institutions required communication and organization. Someone had to record populations. Someone had to calculate resources. Someone had to organize taxation. Someone had to maintain records. Someone had to coordinate military logistics across unimaginable distances. The Imperium needed administration on a scale humanity had never attempted before. Malcador helped create the structures that would eventually become the Administratum, but administration was only one part of his work. Malcador also helped create the Officio Assassinorum. The Imperium faced enemies that could not always be defeated by armies. Sometimes a rebellion could be stopped by killing a single governor. Sometimes an enemy commander needed to disappear. Sometimes an alien infiltrator needed to be eliminated before anyone even knew that an invasion had begun. And sometimes the Imperium itself required people who could kill in absolute secrecy. The Assassinorum became that instrument. Malcador secretly served as its first Grand Master of Assassins. This tells us something important about his character. Malcador was not a gentle old scholar. He was capable of extraordinary ruthlessness. He understood that the Imperium was being built in a galaxy where hesitation could mean extinction. He was willing to use assassination, espionage, psychological manipulation, and other methods if he believed they were necessary for humanity's survival. His morality was therefore deeply imperial. The individual mattered less than the survival of the species, and Malcador understood that principle perhaps better than anyone. He also played an important role in the creation of institutions that would eventually become the Imperial Inquisition. The Inquisition would become one of the most feared organizations in the Imperium. Its agents would hunt heretics, mutants, witches, daemons, and aliens. But its roots went back to the secret preparations made during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. Malcador understood that the greatest threats to humanity were not always visible. Some enemies could infiltrate governments, some could corrupt military commanders, some could manipulate minds, some could emerge from the warp itself. And one of Malcador's greatest fears was chaos. He understood the danger of the warp better than most. Malcador was an extraordinarily powerful psyker himself. Indeed, he was perhaps the second most powerful naturally born human psyker in history after the Emperor, although the exact hierarchy remains debated, particularly when figures such as Magnus the Red are considered. But Malcador's power was not simply raw destructive strength. His abilities included extraordinary telepathy and telekinesis. He could communicate across enormous distances. He could manipulate minds. He could exert force through psychic power. He could shield information. He could conceal things from beings who would otherwise have discovered them. And he possessed a mental resilience that allowed him to survive situations that should have killed an ordinary human instantly. One of the most remarkable examples occurred during the confrontation involving Lorgar. Malcador's physical appearance made him look vulnerable. He was slender. He was elderly. He did not possess the immense physical strength of an Astartes. He was certainly nothing compared to a Primarch in physical combat. And yet, Malcador was capable of surviving encounters with beings who could tear ordinary humans apart with their bare hands. His true weapon was his mind. That was the terrifying thing about Malcador. You could underestimate him. You could look at the old man in robes and assume that he was merely an administrator, and that mistake could be fatal. Malcador's intelligence was arguably as dangerous as his psychic power. He was an exceptional strategist and political operator. He understood people, he understood institutions, he understood secrecy, and he understood that information was one of the most powerful weapons in existence. This became increasingly important when the Emperor's Primarchs were reunited with him. The Primarchs were magnificent beings. They were commanders, conquerors, and demigods, but they were also individuals with immense personalities. They had rivalries. They had ambitions. They had fears. They had weaknesses. Malcador had to operate in a political environment where some of the most powerful beings in the galaxy could not always be trusted to cooperate. He was therefore involved in many of the decisions surrounding the Great Crusade. One particularly important event was the Council of Nicaea. The use of psychic powers by the Space Marine legions had become increasingly controversial. Librarians were powerful psykers. They could manipulate the warp and unleash abilities that ordinary humans could barely comprehend. But the warp was also the realm of chaos. The Emperor feared that unrestricted psychic experimentation could open the door to corruption. The Council of Nicaea, therefore, became a defining moment. The Emperor ultimately placed severe restrictions upon the use of psychic powers by the Legions Astartes. Malcador played an important role in delivering the Chaplain Edict. The chaplains were intended to maintain discipline among the Space Marines. They would monitor the legions. They would guard against deviations from the Imperial truth. They would watch for forbidden psychic practices, and they would ensure that the Emperor's orders were obeyed. The creation of the Chaplain Institution was another example of Malcador's preference for systems. Instead of relying entirely on individual loyalty, he helped create structures that would monitor and reinforce that loyalty. But the Council of Nicaea would later become one of the great tragedies of the Great Crusade. The ban on librarians did not eliminate psychic power. It did not eliminate chaos. And when the Horus Heresy began, many of the Imperium's assumptions about the warp collapsed. Horus, the Emperor's chosen warmaster, turned against his father. Half of the Primarchs followed him. Legions that had fought together for decades began slaughtering one another. The Great Crusade became a civil war. The Imperium began tearing itself apart. And Malcador found himself at the center of the greatest crisis humanity had ever experienced. The Horus Heresy was not simply a military conflict. It was a war of ideology, loyalty, information, and survival. Malcador became one of the Emperor's most important agents during this period. He helped coordinate resistance. He gathered loyal warriors. He maintained networks of information. He worked with individuals who would later become the foundations of the Inquisition. And perhaps most importantly, he began preparing for a future beyond the heresy. Malcador understood that even if Terra survived, the Imperium would be fundamentally changed. He therefore began selecting individuals who could carry humanity's fight against chaos into the distant future. This would lead to one of his greatest achievements, the creation of the Grey Knights. Malcador understood that the original Space Marine legions had been designed primarily to fight physical enemies. But chaos was different. Daemons were not simply armies. They were manifestations of the warp. They could corrupt minds. They could possess bodies. They could twist reality. They could exploit weaknesses in even the strongest warriors. Malcador therefore argued that humanity needed a specialized force dedicated specifically to fighting the demonic threats of chaos. The Emperor eventually accepted this necessity. Before the Siege of Terra, Malcador presented 12 individuals to the Emperor. Among them were 8 Astartes. These warriors came from both loyalist and traitor legions. Among them were figures such as Tylos Rubio, Massa Varan, Janus, Epimetheus, and Chiron. The remaining individuals included mortals such as Carol Sinderman, Lemuel Gaumon, and Amandera Kendall. These people represented the foundations of something new. The Emperor approved Malcador's choices. The group was then divided according to their future missions. The mortal members would help establish the foundations of what would eventually become the Inquisition. The Astartes would travel with Malcador to Titan. Titan was a moon of Saturn, and it would become the birthplace of the Grey Knights. But Titan was not simply a secret base. Malcador had something much more ambitious planned. The moon would be hidden. Using his psychic abilities and powerful protective technologies, Malcador concealed Titan from the forces tearing apart the Sol system. A fortress monastery had already been prepared there. Supplies had been gathered, vehicles had been prepared, weapons had been stockpiled, gene seed had been secured, and thousands of aspirants had been assembled. These recruits came from across the galaxy. Every one of them possessed psychic potential. The new warriors would not form another legion. Instead, they would become a chapter, a specialized force, a weapon against daemons, a force that could operate where ordinary space marines could not. Malcador chose Janus to become their first Supreme Grand Master, and then he did something extraordinary. He hid Titan within the warp. Using immense psychic power, protective fields, and ancient sigillic rites, Malcador concealed the entire moon from the destruction surrounding Terra. Titan vanished. The galaxy entered its darkest hour, and the Grey Knights remained hidden. Malcador had created a weapon for a future that he knew he might never see. But his greatest challenge was still ahead. The Siege of Terra. The traitor forces had reached the solar system. The Imperial Palace was surrounded. The Emperor was trapped. The Webway project beneath the palace had become a catastrophic vulnerability. Demonic forces were pouring into the Webway. The Emperor needed to remain on the Golden Throne to contain the breach. But the final battle required him elsewhere. Eventually, the situation became impossible. The Emperor had to confront Horus, but if he left the Golden Throne, the warp breach could overwhelm Terra. Someone had to take his place. That someone was Malcador. He knew what would happen. The Golden Throne was not simply a chair. It was an unimaginably powerful device. The Emperor himself had been using it to maintain the Webway project and protect Terra from the forces of the warp. For an ordinary human, taking his place was effectively impossible. For Malcador, it meant death. But Malcador did not hesitate. He took the Emperor's place. And suddenly, the old man who had spent thousands of years operating from the shadows was holding back the forces of chaos with the full power of his mind. His body began to fail. His strength was consumed. His life was being burned away. But he continued. Because the Emperor needed to fight Horus, the Emperor left the Golden Throne. He boarded the Vengeful Spirit, and Malcador remained behind. The final battle between the Emperor and Horus began. Every second mattered. Malcador was dying. The throne was consuming him, but he held on. Eventually, the Emperor defeated Horus. The War Master was destroyed, but the Emperor himself was mortally wounded. He was brought back to the Imperial Palace, and Malcador was still upon the Golden Throne. The Emperor's condition was catastrophic. His body was dying. The Emperor needed to give his final instructions, and Malcador did something even more remarkable. He used what remained of his life energy to keep the Emperor alive. The old Sigillite had already sacrificed himself, but even in death he continued serving. He gave everything. His strength, his psychic power, his life, everything. Only when the Emperor's final instructions had been delivered could Malcador finally release his grip. The moment he was removed from the Golden Throne, his body could no longer sustain itself. Malcador the Sigillite crumbled into ash. The man who had lived for thousands of years was gone. But his final act changed the history of humanity forever. The Emperor was placed upon the Golden Throne. The Imperium entered the age of the Imperium, and Malcador became a legend. The Emperor himself declared that he would forever be remembered as Malcador the Hero. That title was not given because Malcador had conquered worlds. It was not because he had killed millions of enemies. It was because, at the moment when everything depended upon him, he gave his life without hesitation. And his legacy did not end with his death. The Grey Knights survived. Hidden away on Titan, they eventually emerged into the Imperium's future. They became one of humanity's greatest weapons against chaos. The foundations of the Inquisition survived. The Administratum survived. The Officio Assassinorum survived. The institutions Malcador had helped create became fundamental components of the Imperium. In a sense, Malcador's influence continued long after his physical death. His fingerprints could be found everywhere. The Imperium that survived the Horus Heresy was not merely the Imperium of the Emperor. It was also the Imperium that Malcador had helped build. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing about him. Malcador was never intended to be the greatest warrior. He was never supposed to be the strongest. He was never designed to inspire entire legions simply by appearing on a battlefield. His power came from something else. Knowledge, patience, intelligence, secrecy, psychic strength, and absolute loyalty. He understood that empires were not built only by warriors. They were built by people who could create systems. They were built by people who understood threats before those threats became visible. They were built by people who could make decisions that nobody else even knew were being made. Malcador was one of those people. For thousands of years, he stood beside the Emperor. He watched humanity fall. He watched it rise. He witnessed the birth of the Imperium. He helped build it. He watched the Primarchs arrive. He watched the Great Crusade expand across the galaxy. He watched the dream of Imperial unity collapse into the Horus Heresy. And when that dream was almost destroyed, Malcador gave everything he had to preserve it. There is also something deeply ironic about Malcador's appearance. The Imperium was filled with monsters. Primarchs were giants. Space Marines were genetically engineered superhumans. Custodes were magnificent transhuman warriors. Daemons were creatures of nightmare. Yet one of the most powerful humans in history looked like an elderly administrator. That appearance concealed an extraordinary being. Malcador could sit in a room and influence the destiny of entire legions. He could speak to people across interstellar distances. He could manipulate minds. He could resist forces that would destroy ordinary humans. He could survive encounters with Primarchs. And when necessary, he could unleash psychic power on a scale that made his physical appearance completely irrelevant. But perhaps his greatest ability was restraint. Malcador did not constantly display his power. He did not need to. He understood that secrecy was strength. The Emperor was the visible symbol. Malcador was the hidden hand. The Emperor conquered. Malcador organized. The Emperor inspired fear and loyalty. Malcador ensured that the machinery of government actually functioned. Together they created the foundations of the Imperium, and together they faced its greatest crisis. Malcador's story is therefore not simply the story of an old psyker. It is the story of one of the architects of humanity's survival. He was a survivor of ancient terror, a guardian of forgotten knowledge, a master of psychic power, a political strategist, a regent, a spy master, the first Grand Master of assassins, an architect of the Inquisition, a founder of the Grey Knights, the Emperor's most trusted human servant, and finally, Malcador the hero. His death is one of the most important moments in the history of Warhammer 40,000, because it demonstrates exactly what the Imperium demands from those who serve it. Malcador knew that he could not survive. He knew that his sacrifice would be forgotten by most of the billions who would later live beneath the Emperor's banner. He knew that history might remember the Emperor, the Primarchs, and the great armies, while his own name faded into obscurity. And he did it anyway. He took the Golden Throne. He held back the warp. He bought the Emperor the time necessary to confront Horus. And when the Emperor returned, Malcador spent the last remnants of his existence keeping his master alive. Then he turned to ash. No grand funeral, no glorious battlefield, no monument visible across the galaxy, only the Golden Throne. The dying Emperor. And a pile of ash where one of humanity's oldest and greatest servants had stood. Malcador's final victory was therefore not the destruction of an enemy. It was time. He gave the Emperor enough time to defeat Horus. He gave the Imperium enough time to survive. He gave humanity enough time to continue existing. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that may be the greatest victory anyone can achieve. Because Malcador the Sigillite was not a Primarch. He was not a Space Marine. He was not a god. He was human. And despite that, he stood beside the Emperor, helped shape the Imperium, helped prepare humanity for the horrors of chaos, created institutions that would survive for 10,000 years, and finally sacrificed his own existence to ensure that humanity had one more chance to survive. That is why the Emperor called him Malcador the hero. And that is why, even after 10,000 years of Imperial history, the name Malcador the Sigillite still carries enormous weight. He was the man behind the throne, the keeper of secrets, the ancient survivor, the hidden architect, the Emperor's regent, and ultimately the man who gave his life so that the master of mankind could live. Malcador the Sigillite did not die fighting for the Imperium. He died holding it together.